Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome to this multi-part tutorial series in which I'm going to be demonstrating how to install multiple different operating systems in a variety of different arrangements. So hopefully in doing this I will cover all of the major situations that might arise when you're deciding which operating system to install and which path to follow in order to install one or multiple different operating systems. Now, I'm going to be following up my previous tutorials in which I showed how to build your own computer system. So my assumption here is that you now have a freshly built computer system with a blank hard drive and you're now looking to move forward and start to install one or more operating systems onto it. Obviously this may not be the case for you, and in a minute I'm going to go ahead to the next slide in which I show at least my projected outline for the next 5 or 6 videos in this series. And you can use that as a reference to determine which one is going to suit your needs the best and jump ahead to one of those videos if that's your situation. But before I do that, I'm going to cover all of the general options so that you can make the best decision about which path you want to follow at least. So the first thing that we can do is just install a single operating system or single installation. And if that's our situation, we might decide that we want to go with the Windows family of operating systems, and in that we can have Windows XP, Windows 7, Windows 8, or if we want to go with a Windows Server, we have 2003, 2008, and now the new 2012 editions. Alternately, well, before I move to that, I would mention that usually you have to pay for a fully licensed copy of Windows in order to do this. I say usually because in some cases, if you're a student, you can actually join and become part of the MSDN, Microsoft Developer Network, in which you can access their operating systems and use them for, I guess, what they would call a learning experience. So you can download these for free and use them usually for some trial period. I think most recently I downloaded the 2012 version using my MSDN and it gave me access for 1 year. So if you're a student, you can usually register through Microsoft and get access to something like that. Now, alternately, you can use Linux, and for that we have the Ubuntu Desktop and Server editions, which are probably the most notable ones, as well as the Mint Desktop edition. And then I'm not really going to be covering these, but you have CentOS and Red Hat Enterprise Linux, and these two fall into the Red Hat line of Linux, whereas these are in the Debian line of Linux. So you can Google and check out the differences between those and maybe look at screenshots and see some feedback and determine which ones you might want to use. But for these tutorials I put together, I'm really only going to be covering the Ubuntu Server, Ubuntu Desktop, and Mint Desktop editions. Now, if you wanted to get a feel for using Unix or Unix-like operating systems, there's the BSD line, which is, I believe it stands for Berkeley Software Distribution. And the major ones that I'm aware of in that line are FreeBSD and OpenBSD. Now again, these are freely available. And finally, there are the penetration testing Linux. So most notably you have Backtrack Linux, which is used for security and penetration testing and things like that. Now you may also decide that you want to install Windows and Linux alongside each other, for example. And again, this is just one example. You can actually decide that you want 3 different copies of Linux all alongside each other, or maybe Windows and 2 different versions of Linux. It doesn't really matter. This falls into what's known as dual or multi-booting. Now with this, we can only choose to run one of them at a time. So what will happen is when you boot up your computer, you'll see some boot manager pop up, such as Grub, and it'll give you a menu with a choice selection. So you would say the first one boot into Windows, or the second one boot into Linux. And then for the remainder of using that session, you're going to be using one of those until you restart the computer and get that choice again. Now, finally, later on, we're going to cover the topics of virtualization, and I'm going to be using Oracle's VirtualBox software. Initially, I'm going to be using it inside of an OS like Windows, and then I'll do it non-graphically inside of our server edition of Linux. What you do with that is you're going to designate a host operating system. So we'll boot up a copy of Windows, let's say. We'll run Oracle's VirtualBox software, and then inside of that we're going to install one or more other operating systems that can run at the same time. So just to show you what I mean, if we jump to here, I have a copy of VirtualBox, and you can see on the left here there's a whole list of different operating systems or guests that I have installed. And if I just jump into this window here, now I'm inside my Windows host here, but on top of it I now have a copy of Ubuntu Linux running, so I can now interact with this at the same time that I can interact with Windows. And then finally we'll get into VMware's ESXi and vSphere, which is a hypervisor suite. And this differs a little bit from VirtualBox, and we'll get into the differences when we get into those tutorials later on. So this is the guide and the projected next series of videos, at least, that I plan to release. So in phase 1, we're going to be installing a single operating system to a brand new empty hard drive. And for this, I'm going to be installing Ubuntu Server. In phase 2, we're going to take that and we're going to build off of it. We're going to dual boot. So we're going to put Windows 7 right alongside our Ubuntu Server. And you'll see that you get that menu option to decide which one you want to boot right when you start up the system. The reason I'm doing it in this order is because when we install Windows as a secondary install, that means after we already have Linux, it can be a little bit tricky because Windows tends to want to overwrite the master boot record, and that kind of makes it a little difficult to load up Linux until we have to do a little bit of extra work at first. So I'm going to be doing that just to cover those bases for you. Then in phase 3, we're actually going to triple boot, so we're going to build off of that a little further. We're going to install Linux Mint alongside of our Windows 7 and our Ubuntu Server. And then finally, well, not finally, but in phase 4, we're going to start getting into virtualization. So the first thing we're going to do is open up our Windows 7 host, and we're going to install a graphical version of VirtualBox and create a virtual guest using Linux inside of that. And that's what I just demonstrated running on my machine. Then we'll follow that one up by setting up a headless version of VirtualBox inside of our Ubuntu server. And what that means is we're going to be using strictly command line. So there's not going to be any graphical user interface. Everything is going to be typed out commands. And so we're going to create a virtual guest inside of that, in which we create Windows Server 2012. Now, Windows Server is going to be graphical itself, but it's going to be run inside of our non-graphical Ubuntu server. And then finally, we'll finish up in phase 6 with setting up and managing virtualization using VMware's ESXi and vSphere hypervisor. So with that, we'll have to do a whole bunch of registering and signing up for a bunch of software, and we'll cover that. It's a pretty powerful suite of tools that we can use, so that's going to be a pretty extensive, that might actually cover multiple different tutorial videos. Now in the meantime, we're going to be starting off by installing Linux, so we need to cover some of the background information with that and prepare all of the necessary tools and downloads that we need to move forward. Now a little bit of a quick background on Linux. It was created by Linus Torvalds in 1991. It's an open source operating system built on the Linux kernel, obviously. It's available in many different distributions, or distros as you might see it called. We have the Debian line and the Red Hat Enterprise line, which I kind of talked about a little bit before. There are many different variations serving specific purposes, so you have your desktop editions, your server editions. There's versions for embedded systems such as smartphones. Android itself is actually built on Linux. There are live versions which boot right off of a CD or a USB drive, and they would allow you to do some temporary work or demonstration purposes. For example, if you have a Windows computer that has a virus or it doesn't boot up properly and you need to access your files, you can use a Linux live CD, boot straight from that, and then actually access and see your Windows files, and you can remove the virus or you can fix broken aspects of your Windows system or whatever you need to do. And then finally, we have this notion of LAMP servers, and what this stands for is Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. Apache is a web server, MySQL is a relational database system, and PHP is a back-end scripting language. And what this is used for is really to create web servers that can dynamically load pages and store information to a database. So statistically, somewhere around 60% of web servers are reported to be running Linux, and over 90% of the top 500 supercomputers have been reported to be running Linux. There's different ways to install, and we covered most of these, the live CD being the one that I just talked about recently, so we're not really going to cover this slide anymore. And now the things that we need to move forward. First, we need an image file or the image files for the various Linux distributions that we intend to use. So we're going to want Ubuntu Server in this case, and you have to download it based on whether your system is 32 or 64-bit. If you're using an older system, you want 32-bit. If you followed the build exactly as I had done it previously and you have a pretty new computer, it can probably handle 64-bit. The only time you really need the 64-bit, if you have more than 4 gigabytes of RAM and you want to access all of it, you definitely need you're going to need the 64-bit edition. Alternately, you can use Ubuntu Desktop, or alternate to Ubuntu, we can use Linux Mint, which only comes in Desktop Edition. Again, you have to choose between 32 and 64-bit. And there are some options. We're going to be using the Cinnamon interface. This pretty much just has to do with the look and feel of it. It is known as a session manager, and we'll see that you can actually change that later on. Now you're also going to need either a blank CD, a blank DVD, or a USB thumb drive. I would recommend somewhere around a 4 gigabyte one. If it's more, that's fine. If it's less, it's still probably fine, but you might run into some problems if it's only 1 gigabyte, for example. Just make sure that it is blank, or you back up anything that's on there that you need, because what we use it for, we're going to end up wiping it clean. So if you're going to go the CD or DVD route, you're going to need obviously a CD burner or DVD burner. And to do that, we're going to use some freely available software for Windows called Deep Burner. If you want to go the USB thumb drive route, we're going to use some software called UNetbootin, and it's available for Windows, Mac, and Linux. And then later on, when we get into virtualization, you have VirtualBox, which is freely available from Oracle, VMware Play, which is also freely available. You have to register some information, and vSphere ESXi, which is available as a trial, and then you can continue using it, although a little bit limited, for free after you register a whole lot of information with them. So a few more things you need to just be aware of. Your system architecture, as we said, is it 32 or 64-bit based? That's going to determine which version of the operating system you're going to download. The size of your hard drives, we don't really need to keep track of that, but if you're going to be dual booting, you already have a copy of Windows and you want to now dual boot, you just need to make sure that you have a decent amount of space available. In that situation, I would say have a minimum of 20 gigabytes available. And then determine what your needs are. So do you want a server edition, desktop? Are you dual booting? Are you going to go with the virtualization? We're going to cover all of these topics so that you can at least pick whichever video you want to use or which path you want to follow later on. And then obviously, does your system have USB ports and or optical drives? If you don't have optical drives, then you just want to go with the USB method, or vice versa. So we're going to finish up today by downloading all of the necessary information and tools that we need. So to begin with, we're going to download our copies of Ubuntu and Linux Mint. Again, if you wanted to go the route of using Red Hat or CentOS, you can do that. I'm not going to really cover those, but feel free to do it if you want. We're going to use Deep Burner to create a bootable CD or DVD. We'll use this UNetbootin to create a bootable USB drive. and we might just download the VirtualBox software, but we're not going to actually set it up or use it today. So you can either download it now or just skip until we cover that later on. So let me just jump to here, and if we go to ubuntu.com/download, you can see here you have your various different choices. So we're going to be using, for right now, the server edition. Most recent version is 12.10. If you want to go with the long-term support, you will use the LTS version, obviously. So here you have the choice between 32 and 64-bit. 64-bit is recommended, so you go ahead and you load it. Now the same thing if we go to linuxmint.com/download.php. You have here the various different downloads, and again we have this mat, or whatever, however you pronounce that, or you can use the cinnamon version, which we're going to be using. Pick your 32 or 64-bit, click it to download, and then of course we want DeepBurner. So if you go to www.deepburner.com/?r=download, we specifically want the DeepBurner free, not the portable edition, just this one right here, so we can download that. If we go to unetbootin.sourceforge.net, we get to this page here. Now depending on which operating system you're running right now, I'm using Windows, so I would click this. Let that download. And then if we go to www.virtualbox.org/wiki/downloads, we can download here. In this case, I have a Windows host. That's my Windows computer here. So I'm going to download this copy right here. And I believe that's the only one that you're going to need for this tutorial, because when we cover it using the headless version inside Linux, we're actually going to be downloading it from the command line itself. So do all of this, let all of it download, and then we'll move ahead. Now I've already downloaded all of this, so I don't really need to do it again. But we'll start now with our USB drive. So we're going to open up our unetbootin program, and you'll get an interface like this. Now let me just open up our Explorer, and you can see here I have my USB drive, and it's labeled as I. And there's some stuff on here which I don't need, so I'm not worried about it. Obviously back this up if you need it, because we're going to be wiping it out. And here we're going to go down here, select disk image, ISO. Now we're going to navigate to wherever on our drive we had downloaded to. So now I'm just going to jump to my operating systems folder, and if I go to Linux, we'll go to server, and here is my ISO, 12.04, 64-bit for Ubuntu server. I'm going to click open, and now the type, we're going to be using USB drive. Do I want to use drive F? No, I want to use I, and let me just double check that that's correct. It says here that's drive I, which is the one we want to use. And now I'll just select OK. It will probably pop up with a warning. And of course it's going to crash, so let me close this program. Let me just check one thing out here. Okay. Of course this would happen. Okay, it seems like I got this working again. And let me just make sure I'm actually recording. So we go down here, we select our disk image. We want our Ubuntu 12.04. You may have downloaded the 12.10. It's up to you, whichever one you used, and select OK. USB, we want to select our drive I. In my case, yours might be different. Just make sure you select the right one. Alright, it says it already exists. There's information on it. We're going to overwrite all of these files. That's fine with me. So now that's going to take that copy of Ubuntu that we had downloaded, and it's going to put it onto our USB thumb drive and make it actually bootable, just as it would any bootable CD that you put in. And while that's running, I'm actually going to go ahead and put in a blank DVD. So in that case, when we open up Deep Burner, for example, well, you get this little pop-up when you put in your blank disk. Just exit out of that. You can open up Deep Burner, and it'll ask you what you want to do. We want to burn an ISO image, so we'll select that option. Now, we want to select our image. So if we go down here, we're going to, well, in this case, I'm going to use Linux Mint because we already have a bootable USB drive for Ubuntu. So now let me select our Linux Mint. In this case, I have 32-bit. Doesn't really matter. It's the same process either way. So you select your ISO that you had downloaded. We're going to select Open. Select whichever burner you're going to be using. Make sure all of this is correct. And now you want to go up here to your recorder and say Burn ISO. And we can see that it's starting to write. Now we'll just go back and check our USB. Alright, it looks like our deep burner finished before our USB. So it's probably going to make some obnoxious noise and then pop out the disk. And at that point, the disk is ready to go. But in this case, I actually need the USB to move forward. But for this tutorial, I'm actually going to wrap it up here, and then the next one we're going to be taking this USB that I created and using it to install our Ubuntu Server Edition onto our new computer. So check out the next tutorial, and thanks for watching.